You have 24 hours to surrender them to the cages. That was the ultimatum delivered to Bill Oxley, a reclusive veteran who walked with 5 massive German shepherds and absolutely no leashes. The town called them a ticking time bomb. But when a catastrophic nor'easter strikes and silence becomes a matter of life and death, Bill packs his gear not to surrender, but to disappear into the frozen dark. Will his defiance cost him everything, or will the very beasts the town fears become their only salvation? Welcome to Veteran Honor Chronicles. We invite you to gently press the subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a tribute to resilience. Now, let us walk into the fog. The fog that rolled into Oakhaven Harbor did not drift. It invaded. It swallowed the rusted trawlers bobbing in the slip and muted the early morning cries of the gulls to distant, mournful echoes. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel, a heavy, damp cold that seeped through the thickest wool coats. It was in this gray, spectral hour that the townspeople usually saw them. They emerged from the mist like a single organism. First came the rhythmic tap of paws on the wet asphalt, a sound so synchronized it resembled a military march. Then the silhouette of a man appeared, tall but bent like a wind-twisted pine on the cliffs. Bill Oxley walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, a permanent reminder of a jungle patrol in 1968. He wore an olive-drab field jacket that had long since lost its water resistance, the fabric frayed at the cuffs and collar. But no one looked at Bill. All eyes were drawn to the 5 shadows moving around him. 5 German shepherds flanked the old man in a perfect V formation. They wore no collars. They dragged no leashes. There was no leather or chain connecting them to their master, yet they moved as if bound to him by something far stronger than steel. Specter led the pack. He was a magnificent creature, his coat a rare silver sable that allowed him to vanish into the fog with unnerving ease. A thick, jagged line of white scar tissue circled his neck, a brutal souvenir from a past life before Bill had found him. Specter did not trot like a house pet. He prowled, his amber eyes scanning the perimeter with an intensity that made passers-by step off the sidewalk. Behind him were Phantom, Echo, Shadow, and Ranger, each maintaining their position with absolute precision. A young fisherman dragging a crate of iced cod across the pier dropped his load with a loud crash. The noise was sharp and sudden in the quiet morning. A normal dog would have jumped, barked, or investigated. The Oakhaven pack did not break stride. Their ears swiveled toward the sound, assessing the threat level in a split second, and then returned to a neutral position. They were not pets. They were soldiers. Bill did not speak to them. He simply kept walking, his hands deep in his pockets. From the warmth of a silver sedan parked near the general store, Constance Winthrop watched the procession with a tightening jaw. The heated leather seat and the soft classical music playing from the dashboard offered a stark contrast to the grim scene outside her window. She gripped her phone, her knuckles pale against the device. She watched as Specter paused near a discarded sandwich wrapper. The dog sniffed the air once, his nose twitching. Bill made a soft, clicking sound with his tongue, barely audible over the wind. Immediately, Specter lifted his head and returned to Bill's side, ignoring the food entirely. To some, this discipline was a marvel. To Constance, it was unnatural. It was a threat waiting to happen. She dialed a number she had memorized, her gaze fixed on the scar around the lead dog's neck. "Sheriff Mitchell," she said the moment the line connected, her voice sharp and devoid of pleasantries. It is Constance. He is at the harbor again. There was a weary sigh on the other end of the line. Good morning, Mrs. Winthrop. Is Bill causing a disturbance? He is walking 5 wolves through a public commercial district without a single leash between them, Constance replied, her eyes narrowing as Bill and his pack faded back into the fog at the end of the street. They are not pets, Roy. They are a loaded weapon, and he is walking around with the safety off. How long until one of them decides to stop listening to his little clicks and whistles? I want something done. Today. She ended the call before the sheriff could respond. Outside, the fog swirled in the empty space where the old man and his dogs had been, leaving only the damp chill of the morning air. By midday, the fog had lifted, revealing a sky the color of bruised slate. The air pressure was dropping rapidly, a physical weight that pressed against the temples of everyone in Oakhaven. The weathermen on the radio were already warning of a historic nor'easter, but for Bill Oxley, the storm had arrived hours early. He had taken a shortcut through Veterans Memorial Park to avoid the main road. The park was mostly empty, save for a few joggers trying to beat the coming snow. Bill walked with his usual quiet cadence, his 5 shadows flanking him. They moved through the dry leaves without a sound. Suddenly, a blur of muscle and teeth erupted from behind a cluster of oak trees. A large, unleashed dog, a mix of breeds with powerful jaws, charged straight for Bill, its growl deep and guttural. The owner was nowhere in sight. In the fraction of a second it took for the attacking dog to close the distance, the pack reacted. They did not bark. They did not scatter. Specter moved with the speed of a striking cobra. He launched himself from Bill's side, not to attack, but to intercept. He collided with the charging dog in midair, a heavy thud of bodies slamming together. The force of the impact sent the aggressor tumbling into the grass. Specter stood over the dazed dog, his hackles raised, a low, vibrating rumble emanating from his chest. He did not bite. He did not tear. He simply stood there, a wall of silver fur and muscle, blocking the path to his master. The other 4 dogs formed a tight semicircle around Bill, facing outward, a defensive phalanx ready for any secondary threat. A woman screamed from across the park. It was not the owner of the attacking dog, but Constance Winthrop, who had been walking along the park's perimeter path. She saw only the collision, the size of the silver wolf, and the other dog sprawling on the ground. Bill snapped his fingers once. Immediately, Specter backed away, returning to Bill's side as if an invisible cord had pulled him back. The attacking dog scrambled up and ran off, whining. But the damage was done, not to flesh, but to perception. 3 hours later, a cruiser pulled up the gravel driveway of Bill's cabin. The tires crunched heavily on the stones. Sheriff Roy Mitchell stepped out, his hat pulled low, against the rising wind. He held a thick envelope in his hand. Bill stood on the porch, waiting. He had expected this. Roy walked up the steps slowly, his eyes avoiding the 5 pairs of amber eyes watching him from the shadows of the porch. "I am sorry, Bill," the sheriff said, his voice heavy. Constance went straight to the judge. She cited the incident in the park. She called it a violent, unprovoked attack by a pack of dangerous animals. With her influence and the leash law violations on file, the judge signed it. He extended the envelope. Bill did not take it. "It is an emergency seizure warrant," Roy continued, placing the envelope on the porch railing. "You have 24 hours to surrender them to County Animal Control for behavioral assessment. If they are not in the cages by 8 tomorrow morning, I have to come back here with deputies and take them." Bill looked at the sheriff, his face as unreadable as the granite cliffs. "They defended me, Roy. They did not put a tooth on that dog. I know, Bill, I know. But the law sees 5 unleashed dogs and a frightened community leader. Roy adjusted his hat, looking miserable. Do not make this hard, Bill. Just bring them in. We will fight it in court after the storm. Bill said nothing. He simply nodded, a slow, single motion. Roy turned and walked back to his car. As he drove away, the first flakes of snow began to swirl in the gray air. Bill picked up the envelope but did not open it. He walked inside his small, sparse cabin. The fire in the wood stove crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He looked at Specter, who was resting his head on his paws by the hearth. The dog looked up, his eyes full of a quiet, ancient trust. Bill went to the closet and pulled out his old rucksack. He began to pack. Tins of food, a first aid kit, a wool blanket, a flashlight. He moved with the methodical efficiency of a soldier preparing for a long patrol. He would not put them in cages. He would not break the promise he had made the day he cut the chain from Specter's neck. Tonight, they would vanish into the North Woods. If the town wanted a monster, he would become a ghost. The nor'easter did not arrive with a whimper. It slammed into the coast of Maine with the violence of a breaching wave. By nightfall, the wind was screaming through the pines, driving the snow horizontally until the world was nothing but a blinding sheet of white. Then the impossible happened. The sky above Oakhaven detonated. It was thunder snow, a rare meteorological phenomenon where a thunderstorm forms inside a blizzard. The sound was not the distant rumble of a summer shower. It was a sharp, percussive blast that shook the foundations of every house in town, sounding disturbingly like artillery fire. Inside the Winthrop mansion, 10-year-old Micah was drowning in the noise. To his hypersensitive ears, the howling wind was already a physical pain, but the thunder was torture. He sat in the corner of his bedroom, his hands clamped over his ears, rocking back and forth. Every time the sky exploded, a fresh wave of terror washed over him. The walls of the mansion felt like they were closing in, trapping the sound and amplifying it. He needed silence. He needed the noise to stop. Driven by a primal instinct to escape the sensory assault, Micah unlocked his window. The cold air that rushed in was biting, but it was quiet compared to the reverberations inside the house. He climbed out onto the trellis, dropped into the deep snow, and ran toward the darkness, seeking the one place he knew the noise could not reach him. Miles away in the small cabin at the edge of the woods, Bill Oxley was fighting his own war. He had been buckling his rucksack, preparing to lead his pack into the forest to escape the seizure warrant, when the first clap of thunder shook the floorboards. In an instant, the cabin in Maine vanished. Bill was back in the Ashau Valley in 1968. The wind became the scream of incoming mortars. The snow against the window became the hiss of shrapnel. Bill collapsed to the floor, his hands covering his head, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The flashbacks were visceral, paralyzing him with the memory of fire and blood. Under the table, a cold, wet nose pressed firmly against his cheek. Specter squeezed his large body into the cramped space next to Bill. The dog did not whine or pace. He simply laid his heavy head on Bill's chest, forcing the old man to feel the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing. Specter licked the salt from Bill's face, a grounding sensation that pulled the veteran back from the edge of the abyss. Slowly, the jungle faded. The cabin returned. Bill wrapped his arms around Specter's neck, burying his face in the coarse fur. Just as his heart rate began to slow, the police scanner on his desk crackled to life, cutting through the static. All units be advised, Sheriff Mitchell's voice sounded distorted and frantic. "We have a missing child, Micah Winthrop. Last seen at the Winthrop estate 20 minutes ago. The family says he panicked during the thunder. He is out in the storm." Bill froze. He looked at the packed bag near the door, then at the raging blizzard outside. He knew Micah. He had seen the boy in town, covering his ears when a truck drove by. He saw the same look in the boy's eyes that he saw in the mirror every morning. "He is not running away," Bill whispered to the empty room. "He is looking for the off switch." Bill knew exactly where a terrified soul would go to escape the noise. There was only one place on the coastline where the unique shape of the rock walls created a natural vacuum, silencing even the loudest gale. The Wind Cave. It was a sanctuary, but in this temperature, without shelter, it was also a tomb. The escape plan was forgotten. The warrant did not matter. Bill stood up, his knees creaking. He grabbed his heavy flashlight and looked at Specter. The silver dog stood immediately, his ears pricked forward, waiting for orders. "We have a mission," Bill said, his voice steady for the first time that night. He opened the door, and together the old soldier and the ghost pack stepped into the white void. The forest was a chaotic white blur. The wind roared through the skeletal branches of the oaks, whipping the snow into a frenzy that erased all landmarks. Visibility was less than 5 feet. For any ordinary search party, this was a death sentence. Bill Oxley pushed forward, his body angled sharply against the gale. His bad leg burned with every step, the cold seeping into the old shrapnel wounds. But he did not slow down. He could not. The temperature was dropping fast, and 10-year-old Micah was out there in nothing but pajamas. Around him, the pack worked with a fluid, silent efficiency that defied the storm. They did not track the ground. The snow was falling too fast to hold a scent trail. Instead, they practiced air scenting. They moved in a wide, sweeping fan formation, their noses lifted high, sampling the wind currents for the faintest molecule of a human presence. Phantom and Ranger took the flanks, breaking the drifts for Bill. Specter ranged ahead, a ghost in the snow, turning back every few seconds to check on his master. They communicated without barks or whines, a tilt of the head, a flick of an ear, a pause in stride. In this deafening white noise, they were the only things making sense. They reached the cliff line after an hour of grueling hiking. The wind here was ferocious, tearing at Bill's coat. He slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the powder, his knee buckling. Before he could hit the ground, Shadow and Echo were there, pressing their solid bodies against his legs, acting as living crutches until he regained his balance. Suddenly, Specter stopped. He stood rigid at the edge of a ravine, his nose pointing down toward the dark mouth of the wind cave. He did not look back at Bill. He simply stared into the darkness, his tail held low. Bill scrambled down the rocky slope, his heart hammering against his ribs. He shined his flashlight into the cave. The beam cut through the gloom and landed on a small, shivering shape huddled in the furthest corner. Micah was curled into a tight ball, his arms wrapped around his knees, rocking violently. He was muttering to himself, a repetitive, frantic sound lost in the wind. Specter entered the cave first. He did not bound in like a rescuer. He sensed the boy's terror, the way the child flinched at the sudden light. The great silver dog dropped his belly to the cold stone floor. He made himself small, non-threatening. Slowly, agonizingly, slowly, Specter crawled forward. He moved inch by inch, his amber eyes soft and averted, signaling total submission. He stopped 2 feet away from the boy and laid his head on his front paws, letting out a soft, weary exhale. Micah stopped rocking. He looked up, his eyes wide with fear. He saw the wolf-like creature lying silently before him. But then, in the dim light of Bill's flashlight, Micah saw something else. He saw the jagged, hairless ring of scar tissue around the dog's neck. The boy slowly uncurled one hand. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the scar. Specter did not flinch. He leaned imperceptibly into the touch, closing his eyes. Micah ran his fingers along the old wound. He understood scars. He understood pain that did not have words. The terror in the boy's face began to melt away, replaced by a profound, silent recognition. He shuffled forward and wrapped his freezing arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the silver fur. Specter did not move a muscle, accepting the embrace with the stillness of a statue. Bill stood at the cave entrance, tears freezing on his cheeks. He watched as the boy who feared the world found sanctuary in the arms of the beast the world feared. Bill dropped to his knees beside the boy and the dog. He pulled off his heavy field jacket, his hands shaking violently from the onset of hypothermia. Without hesitation, he wrapped the coat around Micah's small, shivering frame, tucking the edges in tight. He tried to stand, intending to lift the boy, but his legs refused to obey. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the crushing weight of exhaustion and the bitter cold. He realized with a sinking heart that he could not carry Micah back up the ravine in this storm. If they stayed here alone, the cold would claim them both before dawn. Bill looked at his pack. They were watching him, their bodies covered in snow, their eyes alert. "Down," Bill commanded, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Stay." Phantom, Echo, Shadow, and Ranger immediately lay down, forming a tight circle around Micah. They pressed their warm bodies against the boy, creating a living wall of fur and heat. Micah, wrapped in Bill's oversized jacket and surrounded by the pack, finally stopped shivering. Bill then turned to Specter. He pulled off his thick leather glove and held it to the dog's nose. Specter sniffed it deeply, capturing the scent of the man and the boy. "Find Roy," Bill said, pointing toward the mouth of the cave, back into the swirling white chaos. "Find him." Specter hesitated. For the first time, the dog looked torn. He did not want to leave his master. He whined softly, nudging Bill's frozen hand. "Go," Bill shouted, the effort costing him his last reserve of strength. Specter turned and launched himself into the blizzard. He ran not as a dog, but as a desperate force of nature, disappearing into the storm. An hour later, Sheriff Roy Mitchell was standing by his patrol car at the trailhead, shouting into his radio, his voice cracking with desperation. The search was being called off until daybreak. The storm was too severe. Suddenly, a dark shape exploded from the tree line. It was Specter. The great dog slammed his paws onto the hood of the patrol car and let out a bark that echoed like a thunderclap. He jumped down, grabbed the sheriff's sleeve gently but firmly in his jaws, and pulled toward the woods. Roy knew that look. He signaled the paramedics. "Follow the dog," he screamed over the wind. When the rescue team finally reached the wind cave, their flashlights revealed a scene that silenced them all. Bill Oxley was slumped against the rock wall, unconscious, his shirt thin and frozen. But in the center of the cave, sleeping peacefully within a pile of 4 German shepherds, was Micah. He was warm. He was safe. 2 days later, the sterile silence of the county hospital waiting room was broken by the sound of tearing paper. Constance Winthrop stood before Bill's bed. The old veteran was awake, weak but recovering. Beside him, sitting on the hospital floor, in direct violation of every health code, was Specter. The nurses had tried to remove him, but Roy Mitchell had stationed a deputy at the door with orders to let the dog stay. Constance held the emergency seizure warrant in her hands. She looked at Bill, then at the dog resting his chin on the bedsheet, and finally at the shredded pieces of paper falling from her hands to the floor. "I was wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought they were monsters. I did not know they were angels." She bowed her head, tears streaming down her face, unable to meet the veteran's eyes. Bill reached out a bandaged hand and rested it briefly on her arm. Months later, when the snow had melted and the oaks of Oakhaven were thick with green leaves, a new sight became common in the town park. On a bench sat Bill Oxley, reading a newspaper. On the grass in front of him sat Micah. The boy was holding a brush, carefully grooming Specter's silver coat. The dog sat motionless, his eyes closed in contentment, while the other 4 dogs slept in the sun nearby. There were no leashes. There were no commands. The boy whispered a secret into the dog's ear, and Specter leaned in to listen. They were bound together by something the law could not regulate and the storm could not break. They were bound by honor, and they were finally, truly home. Sometimes the strongest bonds are the ones we cannot see. Bill and Specter taught us that true loyalty is never forced by a leash, but earned through trust and shared scars. If this story touched your heart, please honor their journey by sharing it with a friend or leaving a thought below. We invite you to join our Chronicle of Resilience by subscribing, and if you are ready for another moving tale of courage, simply click the video appearing on your screen now to continue the journey with us.